Colleagues, I have the pleasure to invite back on stage Pedro Conceicao, Director of Strategy and Policy at our headquarters in New York, to give us a keynote of the morning. And after that, we will go to a panel discussion on trust, on legitimacy, and disruptive technologies. So back to the topic where we left yesterday. Thanks, everyone, and here's Pedro.
Thank you, Arndt. I was very happy when Max asked me to speak to this topic of technological innovation, the SDGs, and how to strengthen citizens' trust in government. And I was happy to do so because my own personal professional career started in technology. I was once doing research on physics, on nuclear fusion. Went on from there to become much more interested in understanding the interactions between science, technology, economy, and society. And had the good fortune of doing my PhD in the late 1990s in Austin, Texas, in the United States, at the time where the third industrial revolution was in full swing. And the topic of my dissertation was actually the impact of the transformations that we were witnessing at the time, linked to the internet, digitalization, on income inequality. So that was not a very fashionable topic at the time, but it's interesting that in a way we're coming back to it now, not many years later, but a few years later. And it's also a topic that is very important for the United Nations. For those of you that had a chance to listen or read the speech that the United Nations Secretary General did last week to heads of state and government at the General Assembly of the United Nations, the future of technology was one of the major trends that he felt were important and were going to be defining our future. And he has asked the United Nations to do some work in this area. So many of us are working in this topic. Balázs, out of Seoul, is working with us in this. The Department of Economic and Social Affairs has been doing some interesting work in this area. So there's basically a confluence of my personal interest and background, as well as the relevance of this topic to the United Nations. So it's from that perspective that I'm going to share with you some thoughts about the current thinking as I interpret it. So this is not an official position of the United Nations or UNDP in any way, but it's my personal interpretation of what's happening. So when we think of technological change and technology more broadly, we are always, as human beings, ambivalent about technology. There's, on the one hand, a sense of hope and expectation that it will improve our lives and optimism, but also a sense of concern that it's going to disrupt and cause many bad outcomes. And this comes about regularly. So I'll just give us an example to illustrate. Many of you may be aware that in 1964, there was a United States Presidential Commission, so in 1964, that looked at technology, automation, and economic progress. And one of the recommendations of this Presidential Commission was that each family in the United States should have a guaranteed minimum income, precisely because there was so much concern about the impact of technological change and automation on jobs. So when we think that some of these proposals that we are coming up with and some of the concerns that are coming our way are new, maybe it's worthwhile to look back a little bit, and this is how I will start, and try to draw some lessons about what have we learned with respect to the interaction of technological change with our economies and our societies. So perhaps the most fundamental insight is that technological change is ultimately the most fundamental driver of progress, economic progress and improvements in standards of living. A very simple model of an economy, overly simplistic, I think, and you would agree, I'm sure, basically sees an economy as something that relies on people, on things, and on ideas. And it's how we put together these three elements, people, things, and ideas, that determines how much an economy can produce and how much is reflected then in gross domestic product, etc. So economists have fancy names for these three things. They call people labor, they call things capital, and they call ideas technological change. But it's clearly the case that ultimately it's ideas technological change that drives long-term economic progress. It's also the case that technological change and ideas come into the economy in a gradual way, for the most part. But there are also some technological moments that are revolutionary, as we all know. There was the agricultural revolution, for instance, 12,000 years ago or so, in which humans were for the first time able to domesticate plants and animals. And this basically led to the emergence of civilization. We had then in the 19th century what's called the first industrial revolution, when we started to use steam power to replace animals as the major force, physical force. We had then a second industrial revolution in the transition from the 19th to the 20th century that had to do with electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the emergence of communications. So, and then the third industrial revolution, which is the one that I witnessed when I was in Austin, and I already spoke about it, had to do with the digitalization and the internet. So it's clear that at any time, new technologies imply some level of disruption, social and economic disruption, but it's particularly the case that when we're confronted with these more revolutionary ones, these disruptions are more dramatic and even traumatic. And even though if we look back in the end, the world as a whole, economies as a whole, are sufficiently better off to enable everyone to make progress. As we undergo these transitions, when these technologies come, when you're confronted with these technologies, there's a lot of disruption. And I'll just want to make 2 points that are going to be critical to the argument that I want to lay out before you at the end of my talk. And it is that technology alone does not determine outcomes. And it takes time for other aspects to adjust and adapt to what this new technology mean. So I'll just give 2 examples to illustrate. If you think of the transition from steam power to electricity and the way in which this was used in factories, the initial change was just to replace the steam engines with electrical ones. Now, steam engines were at the bottom of buildings, and then the production took place in high-rise buildings because you wanted to have a systems of belts and shafts that would transmit the power over vertically to where production took place. And to minimize the losses of power, these were very cramped spaces. Cramped spaces, it was difficult to move people around because you wanted to minimize the losses from transmitting this power from the bottom where the steam engine was to the manufacturing machines that were then up in these high rises. So just putting an electric engine at the bottom, replacing the steam engine, did do much to increase productivity. And it took almost 20 years for people to realize that they needed to fundamentally change the nature of manufacturing so that manufacturing would not take place in high rises, but could take place in one floor, very spread out facilities which provide the template for the manufacturing plants that we have today. This was an insight that was shared perhaps for the first time by Paul David, an economic historian at Stanford University. And it illustrates how it takes time for the organization of firms, for the economic structures to adjust to new technologies. But the adjustments go beyond just the organizational of firms or the organization of production. So the second example that I will give has to do with the emergence of organized labor and trade unions when there was this transition from agriculture activities to manufacturing. So trade unions were critical in managing the allocation of the surplus that was generated as a result of these technological revolutions between capital and labor. Remember, if you have this simple model of the economy, the income that is generated can go either to the labor part, to people, or to those that own things, to owners of capital. And the emergence of organized labor and trade unions was critical. It was an innovation. It was a new institution that was difficult to come about, created disruption, but it was critical to enable an equilibrium allocation between labor and capital. And the most interesting thing of this institutional innovation was that the share of income that went to labor has remained basically stable over the course of the 20th century, which is remarkable and unexpected, because you could think that as a result of technological change and as a result of manufacturing activities, most of the income could conceivably go to the owners of capital. But this innovation and other elements, it was not the only one, this institutional innovation generated an outcome that resulted in a stable distribution of income between labor and capital. So this is the past. Now let's look at where we are today and some more recent trends. Because as you know, if you read an investment prospect, if you want to make an investment in a stock or in a mutual fund, investment prospectus always say that past performance is not guarantee of the future. So just because this has happened in the past, we don't know for sure what the future will give us. And there are a few elements in the data that you may have heard about that are throwing some questions on whether we are not changing into a new paradigm. Some people use this expression. I will not go over in detail, but I will just mention a few of these elements. And the first one has to do with the fact that the share of income that's going to labor is actually coming down. So there's more income accruing to the owners of capital than the owners of labor. So this regularity that many of us may have taken for granted for many years appears to be broken down. There's also very high and increasing inequality in the distribution of income. So this is partly related to the fact that a higher share of income is going to the owners of capital, but it also goes beyond that, because even people that earn their income out of their labor, if you take only that component, even amongst those, there's a polarization in the distribution of income. So this is the second trend. A third trend has to do with a dramatic increase in markups. Markup is basically the difference between cost of producing a good or a service that is sold, the marginal cost, to be more precise, and the price at which this good is sold. So in a competitive market, you would expect the marginal cost and the price to be very close to each other, but it never works like that for a number of reasons. But in 1980, US firms had a markup of 18%. Today, markup, the difference between the price and marginal cost, is about 70%. The profit rate of US firms, on average, globally, has increased fourfold between 1980 and today. So this is an indication that there are firms that have extreme market power. in the economy. And the final element of information that I would like to share with you has to do with the breakdown of a fundamental relationship that underlied most of what I said about the way in which technology works with economy and society at the beginning. If you look at the evolution of labor productivity and the evolution of average earnings, so what a typical family gets as income, these two trends for most of the 20th century run in a parallel way. So as labor productivity improved as a result of technological change and other elements, average earnings of a typical family also increased, actually exactly in the same parallel way. And this actually is what we'd expect from economic theory, where we'd expect that as labor productivity goes up, the returns from becoming more efficient accrue to the labor, to the people that are doing the work. This relationship has broken down. Since the turn of the century, you have seen labor productivity continue to grow up. There's a discussion on whether it has been a slowdown in labor productivity, but let's leave that aside. But as labor productivity continued to go up, there's been a stagnation in real earnings. Our colleagues in the ILO have done some studies, and I'll share with you some numbers to give you a little bit more texture of what has happened. So between 1999 and 2013, in 36 developing countries, labor productivity increased by almost 20%. And real wages increased only by 6%. In the United States, the economic expansion that went from the 1990s up to the global financial and economic crisis of 2007 was the first in the history of the country in which there was no increase in average earnings. So all of these elements point to the direction that there might be something new. So what could explain these trends? One explanation is that we are undergoing the fourth industrial revolution. So many of the technologies that we've been discussing today, artificial intelligence, automation in particular, are fundamentally changing the nature of the interaction between technology, economies, and societies. Artificial intelligence and automation, because through artificial intelligence, we are approaching the ability of replicate what humans can do at the cognitive level. So this appears to be something unprecedented. And also the nature, second part of what we're seeing is that the nature of competition and the firms that are successful are dominated more and more by what's called in economics network externalities, network effects. So basically, the more people are part of a social network, for instance, the more power it gives to the company that was either the first or the one that was able to grab this opportunity more successfully. So basically, we have one Facebook. Facebook really does not have many competitors. We have one Twitter, not many competitors. We have one Google, not many competitors. We have one Amazon, not many competitors. We have one or two firms that dominate operating systems, be it of computers or cell phones. So these two elements appear to be somehow changing the nature of the relationship between technology and the economy. So what does this mean? What are the consequences? I think there are three baskets of consequences. First is the recognition that for the most part this is good and exciting, and I think that a lot of what we have seen in this conference confirms this idea that there are lots of possibilities out there. But also, it's the second basket of issues that this is generating some anxiety. Anxiety over people that see their jobs go in manufacturing and now being replaced by robots, for instance. And this is happening, I think this is really important. This is happening now, and it's a very recent phenomenon. I'll give you some numbers from what's happening in the United States. After the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, so less than 10 years ago, there was a sharp drop in manufacturing output in the United States in 1 year of as much as 40%. So it was a huge shock. Manufacturing output went down. And along with this big drop in manufacturing output, 3 million jobs in manufacturing were lost. The number of jobs in the US of people working in manufacturing went from 40 million to 11 million. Today, output in the manufacturing sector in the US has recovered to the levels that we had before the crisis. So output in manufacturing recovered, but jobs didn't come back. Jobs stayed at close to $11 million. So many of these people saw their jobs go, and they didn't come back. Even people that have jobs, good jobs, are worried about artificial intelligence and what it can do, because it's not just replacing routine tasks that can be undertaken by robots, but more and more tasks that rely on our cognitive abilities that can be replaced by artificial intelligence. And there's also a concern of what this means for development in developing countries. The traditional way in which we think about development is transition from the agricultural sector to manufacturing to high value-added services. There's really no other precedent for a pathway for development than this. With these developments, some people are arguing, Danny Roderick amongst others, that the pathway through manufacturing is becoming harder and harder. So what does that mean for development? So in the end, what this means is that despite the sense of optimism and belief in the potential of this new technology and the fourth industrial revolution, I think it's fair to say that there is a sense of insecurity in many parts of the world. Many people are felt left behind, and others are feared that they may be left behind. And so this brings me then to an erosion that appears to be taking place in the trust of governments. People are questioning, are governments actually able to manage this transition, the transition of the fourth industrial revolution? So I'll conclude just with some thoughts on where do we go from here and how to strengthen then the trust in government in this context. So where we go from here, we don't know. I don't know, at least. Maybe some of you do. So, but we do know something that is very important. We do know where we want to go. And this is where I think the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda are so important, because they set out for us the aspiration of what we collectively, or at least the countries that are members of the United Nations, which are virtually all countries in the world, want to achieve in the next 10 to 15 years. It's a world that has no poverty, where inequality has been addressed, where, very importantly, we are able to live in a planet that is not threatened by what we do in our economies, and peaceful, living also in peaceful and inclusive societies. So the whole element around how we govern and how we mitigate conflicts in ways that don't turn violent. So it provides for us the aspiration of where we want to go. And I think that, as I mentioned yesterday, technology is going to be not only an important part, it's going to be essential to enable us to get there. Yesterday I gave examples around energy. I will not repeat them, but today, just to pick up another example, I can speak of the evolution of agriculture, for instance. Through the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, it is possible, it's already happening and can improve quite substantially, to use, for instance, sensors that can be linked to individual plants and optimize the amount of water, nutrients each plant uses in ways that does not waste resources. So there are huge potential for the use of technology, more than that, the use of technology and the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution will be key for us to achieve the SDGs. So, to conclude, while the future pathways that we go through are uncertain, this much we do know, is that the pathway that we choose is not predetermined. It's not predetermined either by technology or by the way in which the economy is evolving. There are choices that can be made that determine the way in which the world is going to evolve. And I'll conclude then by saying that governments play a critical role in enabling people to exercise these choices. They're collective choices that will determine how technology will interact with economies and societies. Remember, at the turn of the century, you also had a situation where you had these huge companies linked to the energy sector, to the oil sector, that were monopolies. And there was a reaction from government at the time by creating institutions that looked into competition, antitrust legislation in the US, and that today is a fundamental tenet of the role of government, is to ensure that markets work in a way that is competitive. So governments, public policies are going to be fundamental in determining the pathway that we're going to chart. And my proposal or suggestion or submission is that as they confront the future, governments should not be either too optimistic, saying that really they do not need to worry about, and technology and economy, things will sort themselves out and we don't really need to think through what all of these new technologies imply. So I think that's a dangerous path. And I think it's also dangerous to be completely pessimistic and considering that there's nothing we can do. Robots will replace humans anyway. So let's just keep on going, doing what we're doing now, because the future is predetermined. So there are two things that I think governments should consider doing to strengthen that trust from citizens in the current context. I think the first is for governments to engage proactively with technology. And I think that the conference today is, or yesterday, I should say, was very much about that. How to leverage these technologies of the fourth industrial revolution to make the government more effective in delivering goods and services, understanding what citizens need. And I think that what we've seen here in Singapore and from other countries is inspirational in a way, because the way I understand Singapore Smart Vision, for instance, is that the focus is not on the technology as such. The focus is on the citizen and understanding what the government can do through the use of these new technologies to improve the lives of citizens. So I think this is a fundamental aspect of what governments need to do. Not reject technology, not oppose it, but embrace it in a way that enables it to fulfill its functions in a more efficient and effective way. And as I said, this is the discussion that we've had today or yesterday, and I think it's a little bit the focus of this conference. But I think there's a broader agenda. I think governments need to think through the kind of policies, the kind of institutions, the kind of taxation decisions they need to make to enable this transition to become one that is inclusive and one in which people do not feel insecure. And this is a much more complex, broader agenda that perhaps calls for the involvement of people beyond those that we have in the room today. So I finish perhaps with an appeal to Max, saying that next year, this is perhaps the topic that the conference should consider, how to take it beyond the topics that we discussed today and understand how governments can shape our future in a way that is inclusive, in a way that people feel secure. Thank you.